next speaker, known to very many of you, if not all of you, I'm sure, Lindsey, convener of the Stop the War Coalition. Welcome, Lindsey.
Thanks very much, Kate, and thanks for inviting me to speak. I wanted to kind of follow on a bit from what Richard was saying about this whole question about the threat of using nuclear weapons, and to read to you from the Daily Mail of the 30th of September 2015. The shadow cabinet descended into open war over Trident yesterday after Jeremy Corbyn vowed he would never push the nuclear button if he became Prime Minister. Now, I don't know how any of you felt, but I was very relieved that Jeremy Corbyn said that he would never press the nuclear button. Not that there is a nuclear button, actually, but it's a very convenient kind of macho kind of way of talking about these things. You know, there's people who are going to stand up for Britain and press a button which will annihilate millions of people in other countries and stop any threat to Britain. And it struck me that all of this, all the attacks on Jeremy Corbyn since he became Labour leader over these kind of things have been done by a government and by people in his own party as well, but done by a Tory government which is absolutely determined to use these issues of war and peace in order to gain political advantage. We had Michael Fallon this week who flew to the Falklands, thousands and thousands of miles away, in order to tell them that the biggest threat to the Falklands was Jeremy Corbyn and not the Argentinians. Now, the Falklands people, of course, said, no, it's the Argentinians. They don't, they're not prepared to play that particular game because of what they've believed all these years, that somehow they have the right to the islands and the Argentinians don't. But this is what we're having all the time, and the way in which it is portrayed as if nuclear war is something which is just about this. It's a bit like the sort of farcical behaviour that David Cameron's conducting in Europe this week. You know, this kind of thing, we're going to be tough and we're going to be strong and Britain's going to stand up for its interests. It doesn't ever explain to people what the consequences of these weapons are. You only have to read the descriptions. I'm sure many people here have read the descriptions of the effect of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki back in 1945 now, which heralded this whole era of nuclear weapons and atomic and hydrogen bombs, to know that this is a weapon which should not be used, should never be used, and shouldn't be used by anybody at all. And of course, the only people who have used it are the United States of America. They were the people who actually did drop those bombs in 1945. But it is such a terrible weapon that we can never allow that to happen again. And this seems to be totally missing from all of the debates. It seems to be totally the idea of weapons is evacuated from actually the consequences of what those weapons are. And the consequences of so-called conventional weapons are dreadful enough, but these are things which are even more dreadful. And I think, therefore, the first important thing for us about the Trident demonstration next week is that we have to make it absolutely clear that there are absolutely no winners in a nuclear war, and that millions of people will die as a result. The second thing I'd like to say is, previous speakers have made this point, so just very, very briefly, that Trident is not a deterrent. Despite what the BBC says, and repeatedly says, that this is the British nuclear deterrent, it's not a deterrent. If you look at the government's own risk assessment, the National Security Risk Assessment, which was carried out at the end of last year, what do they say? They say there's absolutely no short-term threat of nuclear war, of nuclear attack. They do talk about the various threats that people face, and these can include things like natural disasters, but in terms of talking about war particularly, you're talking about the threat of cyber warfare, you're talking about the threat of terrorism, you're talking about this thing called instability in the Middle East, where I don't quite know where that one came from, but maybe it had something to do with previous British government policies. So you're talking about all those different things. Even in terms of the long-term threats, they class chemical warfare and biological warfare as more of a threat than nuclear warfare. So all of this is not about seriously looking at whether this is a weapon which can protect people in this country. That's not what the argument is about, and I think we should be very, very clear it's not what the argument is about. What is the argument about? Well, Ash Carter, who's the Defence Secretary in the United States, put it kind of quite clearly the other day. He said that because all these people start intervening about why we need Trident and why we need to do all these sorts of things. What does he say? He says it's because Britain has to continue its outsized role in the world. In other words, Britain has to have a bigger military presence than might otherwise be the case. George Osborne went to Washington in December, just after the vote to bomb Syria. And what did he say? He said, we're delighted with the vote on bombing Syria because it means that Britain has got its mojo back. Now, whatever George Osborne's mojo is, it's absolutely, again, it is absolutely the case. This is about Britain having its seat at the table. That's what the bombing of Syria was about. That's what the renewal of Trident is about. And it's about trying to say that Britain can play this kind of role. And if you notice what is going on, because there's been various attempts at diplomacy and peace talks in Syria, you look at Britain's role in this. Britain is talking up the threat from Russia. It talks up the threat from Russia all the time. It talks it up over Syria, it talks it up over Eastern Europe, it talks it up over all these places. Why does it do so? It does so in a way that the Obama administration doesn't do to the same extent. It does so because it wants to have an excuse to renew Trident. It wants to say, this is why we're keeping our nuclear weapons. Because unless they can find a threat, then the whole point of having them just won't be there at all. Now, you know, if you look at what we think of Vladimir Putin, what you think of Russia, what you think of any of these, of any of his policies, let's actually look at what has happened in Eastern Europe. What's happened in Eastern Europe is that NATO, which was meant to be not expanding into Eastern Europe, has expanded into all the EU countries which are now also part of NATO. America announced a week or so ago that it was going to send 4 times the amount of troops and weapons that it had to the Baltic states and other countries in Eastern Europe, breaking an agreement which was made in the 1990s that there wouldn't be troops stationed completely along the Russian border. That's been broken. The British have sent ships to the Baltic for the same purpose. And this is all part and parcel of the same thing. What they're trying to do is to increase their influence in Eastern Europe in order not to counter a huge threat from Russia, but to assert NATO's control in the region. And I feel that if we're talking about threats to our security, NATO expansion over the last 20 years has been one of the biggest threats to our security anywhere in the world. Another big threat to our security has been the wars in the Middle East. The war on terror, so-called, started 15 years ago this year. Incredible long time, longer than the First World War, longer than the Second World War, and longer than both of them put together now. We've had direct British military intervention. There's been lots of indirect British military intervention, but direct military intervention in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Libya, and now in Syria. What has the effect of that been? The effect of that has been to increase instability, to massively increase the number of refugees, and to increase the level of terrorism to a far, far higher level than anything that existed in 2001 when it began. In fact, even today, the United States has bombed Libya again, after killing 30 to 40,000 people 5 years ago, it's now, and leading to a completely disastrous civil war which has led to many, many refugees, many people dead and injured. It is now bombing again because guess what? There's a threat of terrorism in Libya. Well, if there is a threat of terrorism, and there is a threat of terrorism in these countries, it is at least in part the result of the foreign policies that our government and the United States and their allies have followed. And the idea that you can just keep bombing, the idea you can keep destroying a country, the idea you can just keep invading and occupying countries and you will bring about peace and stability, surely is an argument which is as bogus as the argument about Trident being a deterrent. These are absolutely not the answer to what people need in order to bring peace into the world. And therefore we have to link these issues together. The question of nuclear weapons and the question of the current wars are very, very much connected. And there are also issues which affect absolutely every person in this country. You know, there's some people in the Labour Party, even some of Jeremy Corbyn's supporters, who say, look, shouldn't he really just stick to domestic issues and not talk about wars, not talk about Trident, not talk about any of these things? Well, to me, Trident is a domestic issue. Wars are a domestic issue. They're not just about what happens over there, they're about what we do to our society here as well, in terms of racism, in terms of scapegoating refugees and Muslims, and in terms of the absolutely obscene way in which we have record homelessness, that we have a health service which is being privatised by stealth, where we have doctors and nurses who are going out on strike in order to defend their living standards. We have all of those, and we're told we can't afford decent health and education and housing. At the same time, we're talking about a possible nearly 200 billion being spent on the renewal of Trident. Now, what kind of a society is it that can do this, that can have this money for weapons, which can have the money for war, which is always talking about the glory of Britain, the role of the empire, all these other kind of things? How can we have this, and yet at the same time we're presiding over record levels of poverty and inequality and misery for people in this country? And it really has to stop. We cannot have a society which is fair and equal and decent for everybody while we have this money spent on weapons of the sort that Trident represents. And therefore I think it's very important that in the next 7 days we do everything we can to make the demonstration as big as possible, that we do get people from the trade unions, we get people from the peace movement, we get people across it. And let's not accept this argument about jobs. Everybody has the right to a job, but they don't have the right to a job building something which can destroy the lives of millions of people. It is not beyond our abilities to find jobs for people which are not involved in building weapons and not involved in militarism and not involved in all those sorts of things. So let's get that argument out there. Let's build opposition to Trident throughout society here in Britain. Let's build an absolutely massive movement, and let's link it up to the other questions. Let's link it up to the fight against racism. Let's link it up to the fight against war, and let's link it up to the fight against austerity. Then we will have a movement we can really be proud of.